I think, there's another whole realm in North America that is untapped. We've spoke of some waste energy resources being recovered on what we talked about, but when you start to even look at hydrogen, and the Canadian Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association's done a fair bit of work on this, looking at whether you call it the wells to wheels, or it's been that aspect of reforming natural gas for hydrogen, and well, how clean is that? And the reality is, when you couple that to a fuel cell, because of the efficiency gain you're getting on the end-use prime mover, it actually does have a reasonably significant benefit on the overall environmental footprint. But if you leave that aside, so let's just accept natural gas is clean, reforming that for hydrogen for fuel cells has an efficiency benefit. You now have areas to capture hydrogen that is otherwise going to waste. So things like chloralkali plants that vent hydrogen to the atmosphere every day. There are other petrochemical applications. You can start to harvest and recover that, purify it, and then it brings up the whole opportunity for commingling gaseous fuels rather than just relying on natural gas. So you can start, I spoke of injecting renewable methane, but there are other synthetic gases that you could start to bring about as well. And there are examples of fuel cells running on paint fumes today. So Ford Motor Company is looking at applications where they'll take the paint fumes from their assembly line, capture that, and rather than use natural gas to incinerate it, they'll use the fuel cell and it will consume those volatile organic compounds as a fuel. So there really is a huge untapped market for waste recovery for useful output, and in many cases fuel cells have a role to play.
Well, I'm going to shift this over to some questions from the audience now. We've got about 45 minutes left of time here. And let's see if we can gather some thoughts from folks out here who might have comments for this panel. Anyone out in the audience care to raise a question?
My name's Lyman Frost from Ceramatech. Been around the energy industry for about 40 years, and I've seen the price of natural gas go above $12 a million BTU and now down around $4 a million BTU. Could you comment on your thoughts about the stability of the price of natural gas going forward?
Price of natural gas. Anyone want to touch that subject?
I can speak to that a little bit, although Ralph may be better equipped than me. But certainly natural gas right now is selling in the $4, less than $4 range right now, is probably lower than it's going to. I mean, I expect in the next couple of years the price will rise. I mean, some of the predictions are that it'll go up into the $5.50, $6 an MCF range, but it's also expected to stay there for quite a while. And some of the volatility, because of our domestic supplies, is really taken out of the equation, along with the development of what is now I'm not sure it's completely seamless, but a fairly seamless national transmission grid where natural gas can go anywhere in the country. There's very little basis differentials that create some of the volatility points that existed even just a few years ago with completion of some of the large interstate transmission projects. So I think, we were just at a conference within the last week or so and there's also a large study being done by the National Commission on Energy Policy and the American Clean Skies Foundation and the Center for Science and Innovative Technology or something like that, looking at volatility issues and what can be done to make sure that's not a factor in the marketplace.
I would only add that previous to the impact that we've seen associated with shale gas, what you really saw was what I would describe as demand side volatility. That demand side volatility, to your point, we have spikes in natural gas prices up to the 12, 16 in some markets, even higher dollars per MMBTU. But now what we see and what we are positioning ourselves for, that's not to say that the market may not change, but what we position ourselves for today is what we describe as supply side volatility. And that is downward pressures on natural gas, where you'll have stable prices of $4, $5, and $6, but you will have periods of spot market gas at below those prices. And so we'll continue to see that volatility associated with any inefficiency in the market, with any mismatches of supply and demand. But today, at least from our vantage point, we think of it as a market that is going to have more supply side volatility, downward pressures on prices in times of mismatch versus demand side volatility.
Question over here.
David Zuckerbrod from BAE Systems. And I guess when you mention the gas pipeline industry, I guess the public might think of aging infrastructure given that disaster in California recently. Do you have the financial capability in the mind space to bring the infrastructure up to where it needs to be? And is that an opportunity, or is it an impediment to adoption of new technology?
Well, you know, that's an interesting question. Actually, the National Transportation Safety Board just came out with kind of some preliminary findings about the San Bruno accident, 50-year-old pipe, and there was no loss of wall thickness in that pipe. So fundamentally, it's a different cause. You know, along with the integrity management programs that are going on, where the high consequence areas are being tested, and even though there's only a very small percentage of natural gas transmission pipeline that's high consequence areas, I think the number is something like 7% of the interstate grid in the U.S. is about 220,000 miles. Altogether, there's around 320,000 miles of transmission pipeline, because some of it's intrastate based on pressure. But because of the amount of pipe that has to be tested in order to test that 7% of high consequence areas, there's really, I think by the end of 2011 or 12, it's either 60 or 70% of that entire system will have been tested. And with the new assessment programs, when you're using intelligent inline inspection tools that are smart pigs, they're called, you know, it's adding increasingly to the safety of the system. So a 50-year-old pipe that hasn't lost wall thickness, to me, is a remarkable statement about the state of infrastructure. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a constant need for diligence, testing, you know, looking for weak points, direct assessment tools where you actually go down and dig the pipe up and look at it and inspect it and all that. But I think that the general infrastructure is very, very stable in our country.
Let me also add to that. I'm a very strong proponent of working very closely with the entities, with regulators. We've enjoyed very good relations with regulators in our various utility jurisdictions to put what we describe as riders in place so that we can replace the older infrastructure. And I think it's critically important that we continue that dialogue. We've replaced some 2,200 feet of what we would describe as older infrastructure in our system there in the state of Georgia. We've had a similar program in New Jersey. And so that partnership, if you will, and the recognition of what kind of infrastructure you have, what needs to be done to assure that that infrastructure is safe and modern and has the ability to maintain integrity, I think is critically important for the industry. And so it's certainly one that we don't ignore, and we place very high priority on that.
Dave, observation?
Just add, I mean, I think there was a question around capacity as well for the pipeline networks. It probably is no secret that with high efficiency appliances, some of the emergence of other renewable solutions like solar hot water heating, there are very cost-effective ways to start to affect what would have been the traditional gas pipeline loads, and so most gas utilities are facing declining average customer use. Now, they may be growing because the sheer number of customers are there, but this probably is an opportunity for distributed generation to really play a role. If those pipelines don't have the same demands placed on them as what they used to. There's capacity now to get into the urban centers with a different means of delivering energy there. And the fuel cells and other technologies would be an excellent means of now starting to shift to that smarter energy network.
Any other questions from the audience, sir?
Charles Rong from U.S. Army Research Lab. Natural gas is a good energy resources which is a clean, easy to use. As the expert and the leaders in this industry, I wonder if you share some sense of urgency that eventually these energy resources will be used up, and the timeline probably, hopefully, we will have 100 years. And do you have any perspective and insight into after 100 years, what would happen? And in that timeline, do we have enough resources and the capability to develop fully independent renewable energy system?
If I heard the question correctly, the pieces of this, the question is, how much time do we really have with our existing resources, natural gas and otherwise, to move from where we are today in our mix of energy into more of a renewable and hydrogen arena? Is that?
Yes.
Well, we can speak to the longevity of natural gas and other resources, but
Yeah,
ultimately these are transition fuels.
I'll start talking just because that's a great question, critical question, really. You know, when you look at natural gas as a fossil fuel or any of the fossil fuels, I mean, the Earth can only exist for so long burning them when you get right down to it. In my own personal opinion, you know, natural gas has been described as a bridge fuel in some parlances. In others, it's, you know, we like to describe it as an essential fuel if you want to have clean energy that really works reliably. And yet, in another 100 years or so, there's a limit to that. I mean, that's one of the reasons why there's a need to keep going with R&D. You know, I'd like to see, and I'm sure there's huge problems with it, money-wise and other ways, for the source of hydrogen just to be water. You know, natural gas has the 4 hydrogen molecules attached to the carbon as opposed to the, you know, seawater or whatever. But I mean, there's a reason. We need to keep working. We need Captain Kirk and Star Command to come up with dilithium crystals or something, so we have all the energy we need forever. Because eventually, natural gas, just like oil and just like every other fossil fuel, will run out.
I think in terms of the resources that we have today and the current size of the market, there are some that are at least based on the shale reserves. There are 6 or 7 large shale basins that are at play at this particular point in time. So some show that we have 2,000 trillion cubic feet of gas in terms of total resources. And we use, as I described before, about 20 trillion cubic feet a year. And so if you do the math on that, it would say you have a 100-year supply at current usage rates. So that at least gives you some sense of what the current thinking is with respect to that resource base.
I think the other thing, Frank, just to sort of jump on, is that it's not just natural gas, but there are other forms of hydrogen, and what we're really talking about here is hydrogen as a fuel. There are other forms of hydrogen that over the next 100 years we'll learn a lot about. Chlor-alkali plants were mentioned. We know they off-gas hydrogen, but are there other types of hydrogen that we currently don't really address today that could be effectively injected into the pipeline and expand sort of the lifetime availability of the fuel?
Well, that raises a point.